All right, let's sew these pieces together. Take your first two pieces and put them in the direction you want them to be in. Flip them over the seam that's going to be joined. This is the seam you're going to sew. I usually start from the inside because those edges are easiest to line up. Take your needle and go from red to white, locking your stitch. You're going to take tiny bites here, just a little bit of fabric, and you're not going to get the paper. I'll take a couple stitches here so that you could see. Red to white every time. This is a whip stitch. Red to white with small bites, not catching the paper. You could see that the red piece there has a little tail, and we are just avoiding that. My left hand is just holding lightly the pieces together, but if this is a lot of work for you, you could use a clip to do that. Once you get to the end of that seam, just lock your last stitch and trim your thread. When you open it up, they will be nicely placed together, and you will be able to see these stitches, but they're pretty small. They're not easy to see. It does not need to be perfect. So pick up your next piece, again, line it up, fold it over the seam you're going to sew, and then I usually start from the inside because it's the easiest to line up. Hold your pieces together, ignore any tails, and whip stitch from one edge to the other. If you're stressed about your stitches being perfect, that's not the point here. Try to take a deep breath. They don't need to be perfect. You're really not going to be able to see them. Here's a good example of what to do with two tails. I just push those tails out of the way and I hold them out of the way while I stitch the seam between them. Really small bites. Don't catch the paper. Don't catch the tails if you could help it. Although honestly, if you do, it's not that big of a deal. When you get to the corner, lock your stitch, trim your thread, and you're ready to go with the next piece. Once your top row is done, you're ready to add the aortic arch to this. It's the toughest part, but you could do it. Like always, line up the two pieces you're going to sew together and fold them over the seam you're about to sew. In this case, you can't line up the whole curve on both sides. So just line up the first inch on both sides. Once you have that lined up, go all the way to the edge, take a stitch, and then on your second stitch, lock it to make a knot there to hold it together. Sew towards yourself until the two curved pieces are no longer right next to each other. Again, this is just a whip stitch with small bites. About an inch out, the pieces are going to get far apart from each other because the curves are in different directions. So unfold it about halfway and continue stitching with it unfolded. This brings the pieces together. This really should be like when you're parachuting in anastomosis. Every stitch is not tight every time, and the pieces that you're sewing together are not exactly next to each other. You line them up as best you can and take the stitches where you think it will line them up later. And then after you get a couple stitches in, you pull up tighter on it and the two edges come together. This is the hardest part. It takes practice. Do not be discouraged. Keep reminding yourself that this does not have to be perfect. Sew until you run out of fabric on one side, and if they don't meet up, that's okay. Now you just have to add the last piece. Line it up and flip it over the seam. That won't work. You have to line it up and flip it over the seam for just the first inch of the seam. That inch is lined up nicely with the two sides right side together. Find what you think the end is and take your first stitch there. This is the farthest edge of the seam. It's going to be red to white and then red to white again with a locking stitch to keep this in place as though it's a knot. Now just whip stitch towards yourself for as far as you can until the two pieces start to get further apart. At that point, take a locking stitch and then allow the seam to open up and sew the rest of it with the seam resting open. Since the edges are not right next to each other, you kind of have to make a best guess about where to take each stitch. I cannot overstate how much this does not have to be perfect. Just do your best to get these two pieces together. Now that your tiny aorta is pieced, we're all ready to make it into a quilt sandwich and quilt it, but we're going to do that in the next video. Thanks for joining me on The Surgical Sewist, and I'll see you next time.